Manipuls. Okay, so here is a brief tour of the development of the Roman military. I'm not going to go through every little thing on here. This is just to situate you. We're going to be concentrating on two out of these items. The Manipular Legion from about 315 to 107 BCE, so that's our first stop, and that's what we'll be talking about today. And then we'll talk about the Marian cohort. The Imperial Legion is going to come up a little bit at the end, but in terms of unit structure, command structure, fighting style, tactics, we're just going to keep it simple and talk about these two critical moments in Roman history when Rome is on the move, kicking butt and taking lands. In its early years, we don't know a ton about what the Roman army was like, or indeed what Rome was like, partly because one of the things that gets lost when Brennus raids Rome is he burns the records offices. So ancient Romans had lost all of their early records, and they had to kind of scramble to fill in the gaps after 387. So at this point, it's a tribal army. It's just a glorified raiding party. When we get into the 500s to about 315, they're doing what Etruria is doing, what everyone else in the Mediterranean is doing. They're a hoplite phalanx with a couple of variations in gear. Their helmets are closer to Etruscan types than, say, Corinthian helmets, although you do see some of them in Italy too, because again, there aren't any rules about what helmet you have to have, so people use what they got. But you'll notice at this 315 mark, there's a bit of a sea change. Now, 315 looks like it's a really definite date, but it's not like they woke up on January the 1st of 315 and they're like, ah, great, we can get rid of our hoplite phalanx and boom, we have Manipuls now. It's a gradual and kind of muddy process that military historians are still picking out. So this is a ballpark figure. The war that we're concentrating on is in the 200s to early 100s BCE, so we're going to concentrate on the high point of the Manipular Legion as well. In 107, there is yet another invasion from the north into Italy, this time the Cimbrian and the Teutones from the Jutland Peninsula. And this occasions a complete revamp of the army, although again, bits and pieces of it are already starting to be phased in when Marius comes to power and ratifies a lot of these changes. Let's see. So some brief remarks about what happens next. The Imperial Legion is essentially cohort legions. It's just the power and command structure that changes, and also the technology available to use in the field and the clerical end of things. So the supply chains and the offices and the training corps and the tax breaks and all of the things that go into having a massive standing army that is constantly forward deployed to multiple borders of your empire. This requires a massive bureaucratic infrastructure. And so that's what's new and different about the Imperial Legion. Once we get to 117 to 253, there's a process of regionalization, by which I mean garrisons are stationed on borders long enough that they begin to adapt to the specific needs of the garrison and also the available technology and supplies in that area. This trend is mirrored as the Roman Empire begins to experiment with compartmentalization, with subdividing the empire into administrative regions. This means that different regions start having different rules and different organizational structures. As you go on, then, the Roman military becomes more and more diversified and also more and more open as the Roman military becomes a vehicle for acquiring citizenship. It also becomes a vehicle for joining the empire. So much so that when the Visigoths were denied citizenship for their service, it didn't end well for Rome, actually. They went on to invade Rome, and I don't blame them. I think it was the right call. Good job, Alaric. 395 to 476 is a convenient pause point more than the end of all things. We tend to talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire as if it's this cataclysmic, horrible disaster that's the end of everything. And historians have backed away from this in large part. What happens is that the political structure of the unified Western Empire becomes unsustainable. That is, due to many factors, including pandemics, crop failures, and difficulties with communication and the maintenance of order, it became more doable and also more desirable to not pay taxes to Rome, actually, and to just sort of take care of your local selves. It's a lot like the end of the Bronze Age. Society decentralized, income inequality flattened back out, mass enslavements of peoples stopped happening quite so much for a while. It was, for a lot of people, kind of a lifestyle upgrade, but it's not the end of Rome. Uh, for the longest time, there was this attitude about the Byzantines as if they're like something completely different from Rome. They're just like fake pretender Romans. That's offensive and also kind of a silly line to draw because Romans are, from their foundation, a nation of immigrants and blended peoples. Like, I guess you could object that they're speaking Greek more than they're speaking Latin, and then maybe that's why people get bothered. But at any rate, it is a direct successor of the unified pan-Mediterranean Roman Empire that continues down till 1473. So yeah, the Roman Empire doesn't go away, it just consolidates, it downsizes into a much more affordable condo empire. 1453. Oh shit, not the numbers again. 1453. Thank you, Mr. Spouse. I am not recording this slide again. Listen to Mr. Spouse. He's a late Empire fan.
It's a little late, even for my late Empire fan.
That's true. But, for me, anything after 200 CE feels a little bit late.
There's a lot of strangeness that goes on in the so-called Byzantine Empire after about...
That is true, but we can't talk about it now because lecture.
1273.
It's like this all the time here, folks. All the time. If I don't stop him now, you're going to be hearing about Byzantines, but we've got shit to do. The shit to do is talk about the Bolivian Manipular Legion. Dun, dun, dun. So this is why I had you read that Polybius discussion about what is the Roman army and how is it put together, because this is our best historical source for this thing that I'm about to explain to you now. Polybius is writing it for multiple reasons. I've also given you some background on Polybius, so do read that, look at it. But he is a Greek hostage. He's a prisoner of war who's living in the household of the Scipio family. And he's sponsored by this family to write a history of Rome. And one of the things he does is talks about why the Roman army is the bestest army that ever armied. I mean, yeah, Rome is really that awesome. If you like highly effective conquest. But where else was I going with this? So he's explaining all of this because he's writing in Greek for a Greek audience, and Greek audiences are used to Macedonian phalanxes, right? So they're like, what are the Romans doing on the back? Like, what is that there? And Polybius is like, okay, let me explain why they're doing this, which is great for us modern people, because for once an ancient person actually sits us down and explains. If only somebody had done that with the trireme. Okay. So this is a legionary structure that's based on socioeconomic class, and that is familiar, right? We remember this from the hoplite phalanx, where you have to be wealthy enough to afford your hoplite panoply to be a hoplite. The Romans take it a step farther. They have different income brackets, which impact where you are stationed in a battlefield formation, how much armor you have, but this is also a status that impacts your voting cohort. So the higher your status, the further from the front of the battlefield you are, the more armor you have, and the more your vote counts. You can kind of see where this is going here. If you don't like the Electoral College, then you really wouldn't have liked Republican Rome. And it took a lot of collective bargaining for poor people to even get to vote, so like that's the good news. Okay, so here we're just talking about this on the battlefield because this could be a whole rabbit hole. The Manipul word, so manipular is the adjective, and this means a legion made up of maniples. A manipul is a basic squad unit made up of 120-ish or so people, lined up in 3 ranks with 40 each. So a rank is a line of people and then 3 deep. So these are shallow, small, little modular Lego brick units that maneuver around each other on the battlefield in order to circulate troops more efficiently to the front of a line. There are 4 ranks I'm going to have you remember for the purposes of the quiz. The first aren't in Manipuls at all. These are the Weletes. So these are the poorest people in this infantry. They are light armed skirmishers. They're the people who can't afford even like the chest protector armor thing. They're out there lightly armed, a lot like peltasts, with a set of javelins, and they're not lined up in ranks. Rather, they're the first to attack when Rome is marching on you. So they run up very quickly, they throw off their volley, and then they turn and leave. So they're a light armored shock troop that's meant to cause confusion and disarray and initial damage in the front ranks of the opponents. If your opponents happen to be a hoplite phalanx, then a ranged volley to take out and put gaps in those lines is a very clever first thing to do, and it's a good use to make of people who can't afford a lot of gear. On the other hand, this means the first people to attack the enemy are the most vulnerable and poor in this society. Although they're not the poorest people in Republican Rome, the very, very poorest people get, oh, yeah, and some of them are Weletes. Some of them didn't even get to be in the army. A lot of them are doing scut work back home. You know, the Weletes are making rent on time, but even so, it's not a great place to be. Next up are the Hastati. So these are the youngest cohort. These are people up to about the age of 25 or so, so late teens, early 20s. These are still poor, not as poor as the Weletes, but pretty poor, and therefore lightly armored. Some of them would only wear like 1 greave on their front leg in order to stay lighter. They also carry a javelin. The word for that in Latin is hasta, which is where this name comes from. They're the hastati, the javelin bearers, and the hints in the name. They're kind of like a slightly heavier version of the Weletes, except unlike the Weletes, they're lined up in ranks. So now we're in Manipuls, and they have a coordinated attack. So they're a little bit like a hoplite phalanx in that there's a javelin volley, and then they engage directly in hand-to-hand combat at the front. They have a shield, they have a stabbing sword, as well as that javelin, and because they're younger and stronger and generally healthier, they're meant to be really good for that first rush where they like scrum you and go at you really, really hard, and then they're pulled back from the front if they've lived for the next line to come up and engage. So the Principes are older, generally wealthier. These are meant to be men of an age to have fathered children already. Principes is the word that gives us prince in English and principal. This means the leaders are the first citizens. So these are men who are old enough to run for office, old enough to own some property. They're over the age of 25, so they have legal personhood and rights. Under the age of 25, you were a minor in ancient Rome. And if your father was alive, you were still kind of a minor, but less of one. You could at least make contracts for yourself when you were 25, so bonus. And they tended to be wealthier both because this was an age where you would start inheriting things as relatives died, but also you would have been old enough to make some money, say, from looting and such. So these folks have more armor. So this is where you start seeing more heart protectors, matched sets of greaves, better helmets. This is a slightly heavier armed infantry. And they're coming in just as the first lines of the phalanx you're facing have gaps in them. They're tired. They're not able to circulate people to the front as easily. And Rome is just sending their freshest, pretty well armed and experienced people up against you. So they're at that sweet spot where they've got enough experience to be really good, but they're not so old that they're showing as much wear and tear. So at the very back were the triarii. Now these were the older men. So these are men 30 plus to 40-ish, 50-ish. I mean, sky's the limit, really. As long as you're out there, you can be in the triarii. These were the guys who had the expensive, nice armor. This is where you'd see the chainmail at this period. These were fully armored, wealthy dudes who had won office and gained a certain amount of rank and status in the city. They were pretty fancy. And they sometimes got very frustrated with this order of battle because often the fight would be over by the time you got to the triarii. So sometimes generals would make them like sit down in the back to kind of keep them from coming in too early. But when things got really bad, right, when the battle was not going well, when your first two lines were laying in tatters, and it got to the point where the triarii got to fight, this was meant to be the last wrecking ball Rome could throw at you, because these were highly motivated, heavily armed, very experienced, and highly invested Romans. Not only that, though, if you were in the front lines and you turned around to run away from the battlefield, you had to go through these guys. They don't like it when you run away from battle. The triarii really don't. And if they're bored, you don't want to be there on that day. So this structure used socioeconomic status and experience levels to provide forward momentum to the army. And it also created a system where financial means matched up well with armor needs, but it did have some problems. If you consider problems having the poor and most vulnerable people in your society be the first to get skewered on the battlefield. I hope you also think that that is a problematic proposition. So here's what I mean by lightly armed, heavy armed. So the Weletes, as pictured, have the lighter shields, many javelins, and not much else. Many times they would go barefoot for added speed and dexterity. The Hastati and the Principes, there's some slippage between them, and even the Weletes, but they'd be in this medium armored category. And our Triarius, of course, has all of his gear on. Some of them did prefer to fight with the one greave, but you see one and two greave triarii in various circumstances. They're nice fancy helmets. Okay, so the next thing that the Manipular Legion does to make use of this stratified small squadron structure is they don't arrange them in one continuous line across the battlefield. Rather, they use the Manipuls in staggered formation. So we call this the quincunx formation, after the way that dots are arranged on the number 5 side of a d6. So on a 6-sided dice, you have That's my attempt at drawing like 5 dots like that. That's a quincunx, where they're staggered in this formation, like these folks are. The enemy's line is down, so here's the enemy. I'll make like teeth and grr eyes, angry. Yeah, there's the enemy. The Weletes are in front here in masked non-formation. So the Hastati, these orange rectangles are really 2 maniples. So you'd have a manipul in the front and a manipul in the back. And then when the Hastati engaged the enemy, the back manipul would slide to the side and front, like this. And then they would form a continuous front where they could fight and engage the enemy. Now, if they needed to retreat, they didn't need to open up a hole in the formation in order to do so, because the Hastati could slip back through this gap as the Principes advanced here, thus allowing the Romans to simultaneously advance and retreat, so that whoever was facing them was constantly getting fresh Romans. And it wasn't just circulation of Manipuls, but also within the 3 lines, you could circulate people from the back row to the front row, because the shields are narrow enough that you can slip past each other quickly and easily without breaking your line too much. And then at the back, of course, the triarii are here to engage if things go very, very wrong. And hopefully by that point, the Romans are victorious. Now, this is a fiddly structure. You have to practice a lot to make Manipuls work. And if you happen to be around next fall, I'll let you guys know. Hopefully we'll be back on campus. Generally, we do this on the field to kind of get a feel for how this works and how hard it is. Very. You can only kind of get the hang of it in one session, and to be able to do it under battlefield conditions took a lot of training. Rome had a large field north of the city where the legions would constantly train in order to be able to do this. And part of why you needed to have a certain socioeconomic status to even get into the legion at this level was that you did have to train a lot to make this work. And this is partly why probably we don't see a lot of other people picking up the Manipuls of formation. It's fiddly, it's a lot of trouble, and it can backfire, as we will see on Cannae. We're not there yet, but Hannibal knows exactly what to do about these guys. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? Nope. That's about it. So here I have a link that I'm also putting in the YouTube playlist. Someone has used Rome Total War to do a demo of Manipuls in action. Just fast forward through it to get the idea. It's a nice bird's eye view of what the movement looks like here, because all of the diagrams in the world aren't going to explain the motion of a manipular attack very well. So have a look at that, get a feel for it. But the important thing is to just remember what the different ranks are called, where they go in the order, and what socioeconomic status has to do with that.